Alright, guys, back again, episode 4. Again, last week I actually talked about a different topic, and this week I'm talking about the topic I wanted to talk about last week, but that whole Roman Reigns heel turn 2014 hypothetical situation just popped in my head, and to be honest, I was like, I want to talk about this, so that's where I went. Anyways, this week I'm actually taking us way back now. Last week was just 10 years ago of what could have been in wrestling. But this one is actually on the suggestion of a good friend of mine. Shout out to my friend Dan for this suggestion. And we're going to be taking a look at something that really could have changed wrestling. And it's going to be in two parts. So part one is going to be, it's going to be about the same guy. It's going to be about Scott Hall, known in WWF as Razor Ramon, as Howard Finkel would say. So, part one is going to be had he stayed with the company in 1996. And then part two would be how would that have affected WCW? How would that have affected the NWO angle? And how would have that affected, not could, but it would have affected wrestling as a whole. So I'm really going to just go for a couple years, really going into obviously 96, but then stopping around the time when the Attitude Era started heating up, because for Hall, and unfortunately for Scott Hall, that's when his personal problems really started getting the better of him, and he was in and out of rehab, and obviously off TV for extended periods of time, even in 1997. So I can't dive too deep into this because I know he had his personal issues, and I don't really want to touch too much on that. This is going to be all about the wrestling. So really, this is only going to take us for about 2 to 2.5 years after he had actually left. So I feel like I actually should back up a little bit and talk about, obviously, Scott Hall left because of the money. WCW was paying him more. And in all honesty, if you go back and watch a lot of the things from 1995, he was being moved down the card, and you could see it. He lost, obviously, his Intercontinental title in 95, gained it back at a house show for a day, and then lost it again. But then he was really putting a lot of mid-card feuds after that. He was working, I think, in July's pay-per-view. It was an In Your House. I think he tagged him with Savio Vega and the 1-2-3 Kid. I think it was actually, Savio Vega, and they took on the Harris twins, who were doing Jacob and Eli Blue at that point. So that was really nothing substantial or important. At SummerSlam, he lost to Shawn Michaels. And the rematch ladder match, which is quietly almost as good as the original from WrestleMania 10. That was SummerSlam 95, for those of you who want to check it out. And then the next month, I'm pretty sure he lost to Shane Douglas, who was Dean Douglas at the time. And he was feuding with Shane Douglas, who had the angle of being a teacher. I know, because of circumstances, he wins the Intercontinental title back the next month in October, but then he loses again at Survivor Series. He's on the losing team. He loses the next month in a tag match with Marty Jannetty versus, I think, Sid and the 1-2-3 Kid. I'm pretty sure they lost that in your house in that December one. And then again, he loses the Intercontinental title to Goldust, so at the Royal Rumble. So really, 95 going into 96, he doesn't really have too many substantial things going on, no real big main events. So I just really wanted to show that he was being phased out, so he definitely, in my opinion, he had reason to leave. But let's say the money is the most important thing for him, which it sounds like it was from the interviews he said in the past. And let's say Vince ups the money, excuse me, and he pays him what WCW paid him, which I know was definitely, it was at least $750, then I think it rocketed up to like $1.25, and for that time in the 90s was an incredible amount of money. So let's say Vince pays him that, and then he stays with the WWF through 1996, and obviously going forward. So the big thing is, I know that he missed WrestleMania, and I've heard it said because he didn't want to work with Goldust. He didn't want to do the angle where it seemed like Goldust had a legit crush on him, and he definitely felt uncomfortable doing the whole homosexual angle with him, where Goldust was stalking him. And then he then put over Vader on his way out, and then Triple H and the whole curtain call thing. So let's just say the curtain call still happens, because they're still saying goodbye. Let's say Kevin Nash still leaves. I think they would still do that where they all break character. Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash all hug in that 1996 famous curtain call incident. So I know the brunt of the punishment obviously fell on Hunter. But I do think that, say Scott Hall stays, he's getting more money. I think he would have obviously gotten reprimanded and maybe had a little bit of a punishment doled his way. But one, he was more established on the card than Triple H was at that time. And two, he's now getting paid almost $1 million a year. So Vince is, unless he does something way worse than that, I think that Vince is not going to job a guy out that he's paying that much money to at that time. Because when you're one of the top paid guys, you want to be put. Vince is going to want to get his money's worth and book you in significant angles. So he had been a babyface for a long time, and it was all about the Intercontinental title. And of course, Vader had just come in, and he wound up, like I said, pinning Razor Ramon. I think that still would have happened. I think that you still need to establish Vader as a top main event guy right off the bat. So I do think actually at Good Friends, Better Enemies, that In Your House, Razor Ramon still loses actually to Vader that April and puts him over. So again, it puts him in a mid-card match. But at least it's against a guy that they had clearly at that time seen world champion, WWF championship potential in. So then we go obviously into the next month, and we go where I think Goldust, he faced the Ultimate Warrior, and then he lost the Intercontinental title at the King of the Ring. I think what would have happened if Razor Ramon is still around again, getting paid all that money, and so he'd still be in a higher card feud. I actually think he would have been the one, in my opinion, in the Jake the Snake Roberts role. I actually believe that. I know Jake Roberts was the one who came up with the Austin 316 saying, but I think actually it still would have been Scott Hall in the King of the Ring tournament, putting over the eventual winner, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Stone Cold still wins it, but I think it's a much more competitive match. And I actually think that even though Stone Cold can still do his famous promo, I think they still keep Scott Hall looking strong in the process by having a back-and-forth match against the heel at the time, Stone Cold, where obviously he can get pinned after a good 20-minute battle. So it's not just a quick squash match like they had. And you would have had the WrestleMania 18 match between those two 6 years early when both of them physically were in much better shape. So you'd still get the iconic Austin 316 speech. And I just think that obviously it would basically put Scott Hall in the same position he was in 1994, making it to the finals of the King of the Ring, but then losing to the eventual winner, obviously, when Owen Hart beat him. You can go ahead with that, and then that's going to take it for the King of the Ring. And then the other piece is, I think, for the next month, that international incident. You remember the big main event was the six-man. It was Shawn Michaels, Ahmed Johnson, who became Intercontinental Champion at King of the Ring. And then it was with Psycho Sid coming back versus Camp Cornette of Vader, the British Bulldog, and Owen Hart. So instead of having Sid replace Ultimate Warrior, because Ultimate Warrior was originally on that six-man team, but then he got fired. So instead of having Sid replace him, I think you go with Razor Ramon. Still a big guy, still a guy that can match up with a guy the size of Vader or the strength of a British Bulldog. And of course, Owen Hart always did a great job bumping for him. And better promo, much better worker, and still, again, in my opinion, very over with the fans. That bad guy gimmick, the whole oozing machismo, coming out with the gold chains, I was always a huge fan of that. So you have him in the six-man. He's going to come up on the losing end again, so I know it sounds like they're not using him in anything substantial, but again, he is in the main event. And remember, it was Shawn Michaels who got pinned by Vader. And they needed to do that to establish Vader as a credible threat and the next number one contender to Shawn Michaels' WWF Championship. And I actually think that that's how it would have happened. And so you actually protect Razor Ramon in this case, his character, because he's not getting pinned. He is on the losing end. And after the match, Sid had powerbombed the British Bulldog and Owen Hart to send the fans home happy. So you could do the same thing where he gives them the Razor's Edge, and the fans can at least go home with a cheer because the good guys got a little revenge despite losing. So that would take us to SummerSlam. And I know the big thing that was going on was, like I said, Ahmed Johnson was Intercontinental Champion, and he was supposed to go up against a debuting Farouk. I think Farouk Assad was his name at that point, doing that whole gladiator gimmick. And what happened, obviously, Ahmed Johnson had the legitimate kidney injury, had to forfeit the Intercontinental title. They do a tournament, and Mark Marrow won that Intercontinental title against Farouk. What I think happens instead is I think you can go back to Razor and that Intercontinental title. Yes, that would be his 5th reign as champion, and I think actually he could have beaten Farouk. Instead of doing the match on Monday Night Raw, he could have actually beaten him at SummerSlam. So you could have had a good match at SummerSlam between those two against two bigger guys, power guys, and they can play off each other. And Razor, one of the underrated things about him, even though he was a big guy himself, he could bump around. If you watch his matches when he was younger, he could bump around like a smaller guy. That's what Kevin Nash said made him such a complete performer, because he could play the big man power role against a Shawn Michaels or Bret Hart. But when he went up against a guy stronger than him or taller and bigger than him like Kevin Nash was, he did a great job selling for those bigger guys and really getting the fans on his side and getting that sympathy as an underneath babyface. And people don't talk about that much, but it's true. So you could have him beat Farouk with the Razor's Edge, 1, 2, 3, and now he is the Intercontinental Champion, leaving that SummerSlam. That would then take us, obviously, to Mind Games the next month, where it was, I know the main event was Mankind versus, it was Mankind versus Shawn Michaels in that match that went no decision. Here's what I would do, in all honesty, because the month before, Vader obviously lost to Shawn Michaels for the WWF title. I think you can obviously build it up where, again, the Intercontinental title was not a demotion at that point, like it seems like it was for a long time in the 2010s and even in the early 2020s. The Intercontinental title still had a lot of significance and a lot of prestige. And I honestly think you could go back, if he doesn't want to work with Goldust, because I had mentioned that, you could actually have him work again with Vader. And in that situation, I actually think Razor Ramon should beat Vader at Mind Games and retain the Intercontinental title. So now he has gotten his win back from earlier in that spring, in that In Your House, Good Friends, Better Enemies in April. And then you have him obviously established again as a top guy, because the only ones to pin him are Shawn Michaels, the WWF champion, and then the Intercontinental champion, Razor Ramon. So only 2 guys have beaten him at that point. And I don't know if he could have gotten him in the Razor's Edge unless they did something where he catches Vader when he goes to the second rope for the Vader bomb. But they can play off something like that. He pins him and regains the Intercontinental title. Around that time, I know Triple H had finally, taken off the dunce cap and served his penance for the curtain call incident, and then beat Mark Marrow for the Intercontinental title in the match where Mr. Perfect interfered and hit Marrow with the chair. I actually still would go with that, because you still need to establish Triple H knowing the star he became, obviously. And I think actually at the Buried Alive pay-per-view that October, Scott Hall then loses the Intercontinental title. And I think you could still do it where, ironically enough, Mr. Perfect can interfere and cost Scott Hall the title, his old tag team partner from the AWA days. And then, obviously, you can go forward with Triple H as the Intercontinental Champion. Here's the big difference, though, because Mark Marrow, when he lost that Intercontinental title, he never had another title reign again. He never got it back. And things got a little messed up because, to be honest with you, one of the things that hurt that rivalry was Mr. Perfect. He turned on Mark Marrow and then he left the WWF like 3 weeks later to go sign with WCW. So if that still happens, then we just have obviously Triple H, or at the time Hunter Hearst Helmsley, feuding with Scott Hall over the Intercontinental title, and they can still do the things that they did. Obviously, one thing that would have changed actually that fall is they wouldn't have brought in a fake Razor Ramon, because I think they brought in Rick Wagner to play the fake Razor, so they're not doing that. Maybe they still bring in the future Kane as the fake Diesel. So, and as dumb as all that was, excuse me, I have to actually talk about how that would have changed, where they maybe just bring in a fake Diesel played by Glenn Jacobs, but there's no reason to bring in a fake Razor anymore because you still have the real one. So I think actually going back into that, I think that then they still do the elimination tag matchup. So instead of Mark Marrow captaining it, again, he was already getting phased out. They lost confidence in him pretty quickly. Vince did, I should say. And obviously his then wife Sable became the real star because Mark Marrow, after losing the Intercontinental title, was just a mid-card guy or doing opening matches for, WWF superstars. No offense to the guy, but that's just what happened. So in this case, you have Triple H and Razor Ramon feuding for the Intercontinental title. Razor Ramon is the captain of the Survivor Series team. And maybe instead of obviously having Mark Henry, I think he got replaced by Jake the Snake. I'm sorry. You can have actually you can have Razor Ramon on that Survivor Series team as a captain, Jake the Snake, Mark Marrow as an underneath guy, and then of course the fourth guy is the debuting Rocky Maivia. In that match, that 4-on-4 match, I still think the babyfaces go over because the debuting Rocky Maivia character was the sole survivor. You can still do that, but in that match, Razor Ramon has to hit the Razor's Edge and pin Hunter Hearst Helmsley, just to establish that he can obviously pin him in a fair environment, where there is no interference from a guy like Mr. Perfect. That would take us then to the December In Your House, and that's when Sid was the WWF champion, and he faced Bret Hart for the title, and I think it was, Triple H versus Mark Marrow, was the opener, and I think Mark Marrow won it by countout. So you can still do that, and I actually would still have Razor Ramon win it by countout. In all honesty, I think he would win it by countout. And the reason I would do that is because obviously Goldust made the babyface turn, and then they went ahead with Goldust for Triple H for the Royal Rumble in 1997. I would keep that because Razor, in all honesty, 5 Intercontinental title reigns, he wouldn't need a 6th. He would need to do something different than, let's just keep putting the Intercontinental belt on him. I know I said it was still a significant title, but Razor could have definitely been the top guy, so a little hint for what I think is going to happen in the future. Or you could have put him, obviously, in a feud with some other prominent superstars and wrestlers, or I just said superstars. Wrestlers, I'm sorry. I don't work for the company, with some other wrestlers and still keep him in a significant feud without the title. So going then into the Royal Rumble, so 1996 closes out, and I actually think that, here's what I would have done, because we had Ahmed Johnson feuding with Farouk in the Nation of Domination. Farouk had dropped the Gladiator gimmick, being Farouk Assad, just became Farouk, and started forming his Nation of Domination with Crush, Savio Vega, and a debuting D'Lo Brown that just played like a security guard for them at that point. I actually think that Ahmed Johnson, he was always outnumbered. You can obviously go ahead. I think actually the Nation would have attacked Razor Ramon the next night on Raw after that In Your House in December to get him as part of the feud. And obviously Farouk can call back, you're the reason I didn't win the Intercontinental title. You got lucky, and we're taking it out on you. We put Ahmed Johnson on the shelf. Now we're going to put you on the shelf. So now you can have the alliance between Ahmed Johnson, who was actually very over at one point. In all honesty, there were there was legit thought of giving him the WWF title because Vader originally at SummerSlam 96 was supposed to beat Shawn Michaels and then lose the belt to Ahmed Johnson. That was actually in the plans at one point. So Ahmed was still getting good reactions in late 96 with the whole "you're going down" chants and everything. And I think you could still have two big guys like that who have each other's backs taking on and obviously feuding with the Nation. One of the other things is then you can then go and so then we have that for the Royal Rumble. I actually think you can still have you can either do it as a tag match where Ahmed Johnson and Razor team up to face Farouk and probably Crush of the Nation at that point. Or you can do a one-on-one match of Razor versus Crush, Farouk versus Ahmed Johnson. And honestly, with the limited in-ring ability of both Ahmed Johnson and Crush, I actually would do the tag match, personally. Because at least at that point, Farouk was still a pretty good worker. And Scott Hall, before obviously his personal issues came about, he was always a great worker in the ring too, in the details I already described. So you have the tag match instead, and Razor and Farouk, I think, go over in that. That would then take us to the In Your House, and with the In Your House pieces, the pay-per-view, Final Four, that has the best four-way match. Excuse me. Oh, shit. That actually, I just want to say, side note, that has the best four-way match in company history, in my opinion. I actually still think that that is the best four-way match ever. When it was Stone Cold, Vader, Undertaker, and Bret Hart for the WWF title. Granted, it was elimination style, but I think that's the best one I've ever seen. And it still holds up if you watch it. So then you still have them feuding with the Nation. They can obviously, I think, one-on-one, Farouk and Razor Ramon can actually maybe even open that pay-per-view. And Farouk should win that because he's still being established as a top guy. He gets his win back for SummerSlam the previous year for the Intercontinental title loss. And it's a reason, obviously, for Razor to still be involved in that angle with Ahmed Johnson. Going into it then, now we're headed to WrestleMania season. And we obviously have it where the big piece is the whole thing where it's Undertaker Sid for the WWF title. Shawn lost his smile. And then you have the amazing submission match between Bret Hart and Stone Cold. But sandwiched in there was actually a match that got, for its time, a pretty good review because it was the Chicago Street Fight, the Nation of Domination versus LOD, the Legion of Doom, and Ahmed Johnson. And I mean, by today's standards, it's a nothing match, it's a garbage match. But when you're not, especially at my age at that time, when you're not used to seeing a lot of weapons, trash cans, a lot of steel chairs, the steps, someone going through a table. When you're not used to seeing that ever, it really stands out because it was one of the first matches of its kind that I'd seen before they got into all the hardcore stuff and what Jon Moxley does basically every week on AEW and waters it down. That's a rant for another time. So you can actually slot. I think actually D'Lo was already part of the Nation. You can put D'Lo in that match to make it 4-on-3, and then, of course, to even it up, Razor to really wrap up his feud with the Nation, in my opinion. You can actually have you can actually do it where, this is, I think, would work the best. You can actually make it where he's in a 4-on-4 match, so it's LOD, Ahmed Johnson and Razor Ramon versus the Nation of Domination, Farouk, Crush, Savio Vega, and D'Lo. The babyfaces can still win that like they did at the real event. And I actually think that's when it's time to separate him from that feud with the Nation. Because I remember thinking that was going to wrap up the feud. Because they have this big street fight. The good guys win, so there's really no reason for them to keep feuding with each other. Because the good guys have won. I actually thought that's how it was going to wrap up. I remember thinking that, I was like, oh, man, they had this awesome street fight. And I wonder what's going to happen to these guys next, because I didn't think they'd keep feuding with each other. This is actually where things are going to get interesting, because I know the next month, Undertaker wins the WWF title, And obviously, he beats Mankind at Revenge of the Taker. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. And then, who did he feud with after? And then I gotta remember who he feuded with after that. Oh yeah, then he had the match with Stone Cold Steve Austin at A Cold Day in Hell, and then the match with Farouk. So I actually would do things a little differently, because I think what happens there is Razor Ramon can then come out the next night, and they were still doing, matches for the sake of matches where he could beat just a random guy. He could beat, like Phineas Godwin or like a mid-cutter at that time, or I think they had Doug Furnas and Phil LaFon as a tag team. He could beat one of them, because now he's transitioning into a new feud. But what you can see, obviously, is Razor, in my opinion, if he stays there, is due for a heel turn. He'd been a babyface since, like about mid-1993, when he started working with the 1-2-3 Kid against Ted DiBiase, and beat him at that SummerSlam. And he had been a babyface ever since. So I think really it could be one of those things where Razor Ramon talks about how he has his sights set. After the street fight, he watched the WWF title match and had his sights set on the WWF Championship. So he can obviously make a hint at that, and at first he can play it off cool of saying, hey, I know The Undertaker deserves it, he's worked hard for it, I was happy to see him win it, but I definitely want a title shot. They can still go ahead, actually, and make it where he beats Mankind the next month, like I said, at Revenge of the Taker, that in your house. But when the show closes, because they had a no holds barred match, I remember. So obviously he's getting beat up. They did the whole thing again. I think Mankind took a table bump that was not talked about, but it was a pretty cool bump because he dives into the table because he's Mick Foley. He dives into it head first and goes to the table. But this is before they had those gimmicked up tables they use now. And of course, it was a pretty physical match. What I think is actually after the pinfall, what can happen, in my opinion, is Undertaker gets attacked by Razor Ramon. Because again, he had established that he wanted a title shot. And he obviously solidifies himself now as a heel in the feud. And gives The Undertaker a reason to want to fight Scott Hall, because he gets attacked after a very physical match, where Undertaker is selling the effects of the match. Razor Ramon comes out, always had great working punches, rocks him a few times, and I actually think he would have been strong enough to get The Undertaker up in a Razor's Edge, and I think he could have Razor's Edged him to close out the show, and held the WWF title over his head, and that's how you close out the show. So the next night on Raw, Undertaker wants revenge. You can still have Paul Bearer weaved into the storyline, because again, he was threatening to reveal Undertaker's great secret that was going to, ruin the Undertaker's life, which of course brought in Kane. You can still have him weaved in. So what I would do actually is Paul Bearer then becomes Scott Hall's manager for this feud. And he's telling him, I'm with your old manager. I know all your weaknesses. I know all your secrets. Mankind was able to beat you, a bunch of different times with help of Paul Bearer, and now I'm going to beat you and become the WWF champion. And then he can make reference to the fact that he's been kind of held down and obviously been slotted with the secondary title, but now it's time to become the WWF champion. I would actually have him face Undertaker at that Next in Your House, which was Cold Day in Hell, instead of Stone Cold Steve Austin. The reason why is because Stone Cold was definitely getting cheered, and he was definitely, a big fan favorite. But I was only like 11 when that match happened, and I just knew Stone Cold had no chance of winning. It was one of those things where you could see it, where it's like, this guy's going to be the champion one day, but it's not time yet. I was like, Stone Cold has zero chance at winning this. And it actually kind of reminded me of when MJF challenged Jon Moxley in 2020. I knew MJF would be AEW champion one day, but I was like, it's not time yet. And unfortunately for Scott Hall, it's not his time either at Cold Day in Hell. And the reason why is I know around this time in real life he had real personal problems in WCW, and he was sent to rehab, and he was off the TV for about 6 weeks, if I remember, or maybe more. I don't know if it would have gotten that bad. I actually think being in WWF, being in a more structured environment, being with a more respected boss, to be honest, who laid the law down better in Vince McMahon, I think he would have gotten things a little more under control. But at the same time, I don't think Vince would have had the confidence to put the belt on him because of those personal issues. I just don't. So they have a great match. I think they could still have a really good match where Scott Hall can then work heel. And I really think that his slower, methodical style as a heel might have led to a slow match at times, but The Undertaker, with that agility, could really have picked it up. And Scott Hall is strong enough and big enough where you could believably think that he could actually trade shots with The Undertaker and at times get the better of him. I actually think that he can... Undertaker, because that match with Stone Cold went to a no contest, I actually think that same match could go to a no contest, because I think what would happen there, if I was to really guess what could happen, was right before Mankind's heel turn, or face turn, that he does that early summer at King of the Ring. What they can do instead, in my opinion, was they can actually make it where they're slugging it out, Scott Hall gets tombstoned, and then Mankind attacks The Undertaker to end the show, and they actually beat down The Undertaker again to close out this In Your House. This way, actually, in all seriousness, I think it works better because it keeps Scott Hall looking strong. He doesn't get pinned. Paul Bearer is his manager, so he can still hold the whole secret thing over his head. And so it gives Scott Hall basically an excuse to get a rematch, even though he didn't win. And of course, like I said, even though Undertaker stays the champion. So it ends in disqualification. It ends with the 2-on-1 beatdown. So it ends obviously with Razor Ramon, Mankind, and Paul Bearer obviously standing over a beaten down Undertaker. The reason I would do this is because the next month they did Farouk versus Undertaker for the WWF title in a one-off match. Farouk lost, and then he was basically out of the title picture. I like the Farouk character in the APA and stuff, but I never really got much into the Nation of Domination. And again, that was another one where, like, you knew he had no shot of winning. So, at that point, I actually think now you have a Paul Bearer stable, because I know he was managing Vader at the time, too. He took the manager reins from Jim Cornette at Royal Rumble 97. So, what I would do, actually, then is Paul Bearer holds the secret over Undertaker's head. Either hand over the WF title to me and be subservient to me, like he was for a time, or I reveal your secret. But what can happen is Undertaker doesn't want the secret revealed. He then becomes subservient to Paul Bearer for a short period of time, leading to King of the Ring. And Paul Bearer can actually reveal, I booked a rematch, or signed for a rematch between you and the man who should be WWF champion, the loyal Scott Hall, Razor Ramon. Because it would still, like I said, it still gives Razor Ramon the out for the rematch because Paul Bearer's his manager. And now Undertaker has to acquiesce because Paul Bearer has the secret. So what you can have predictably happen, kind of similar to what they did at King of the Ring 97, the Nation of Domination was imploded at that point, with the original group, that is. You can have it where Paul Bearer comes out with Vader to obviously make sure that the right outcome, the right man, walks out with the title. There can be a miscommunication where obviously Razor Ramon and Vader have the miscue, and Razor actually gets pinned this time after getting tombstoned. And then, of course, there's some dissension there to close out the show because Razor felt like he had it won if Paul Bearer and Vader didn't screw things up. I know that this actually would bring it back to a quick face turn, but I actually think you need to do this. Because he could then dump Paul Bearer as a manager. He could do that chokeslam he always did, or just clock him in the face, and Paul Bearer would sell after just one punch, be knocked out, and just walk away from the whole thing. and then maybe just give Undertaker some advice of saying, hey, don't listen to this man. Walk away from him. Yeah, so that's my Razor impression. Tells him to walk away, and then of course Undertaker's secret gets revealed, and the whole Kane thing kicks off. So you can still kick it off like that. And then what happens there is the next month, I think Scott Hall is now, as Razor Ramon still, is part of that 10-man tag at that In Your House Canadian Stampede. The reason I think that happens is because at Canadian Stampede, I know the original team was supposed to be, apparently Jim Ross said it was supposed to be Stone Cold, Shawn Michaels, the Road Warriors, and Psycho Sid. But it became Ken Shamrock, Stone Cold, the Road Warriors, and Goldust. Look, no disrespect to Goldust, but he was never looked at, and he was never elevated as a main event guy. He was just slotted in there because Shawn temporarily quit after that fight with Bret Hart, and Sid just stopped showing up to Raw and then went to ECW for a time. So instead of Goldust in that 10-man tag, you have now a once again babyface Razor Ramon feuding with the Hart Foundation. Now, obviously, for a little bit, would have had Shawn's back in that feud. They could have worked together, but then Shawn obviously quit before coming back a month later. But now you have Stone Cold, Razor Ramon, Ken Shamrock, and the Legion of Doom versus the Hart Foundation, Bret Hart, Owen Hart, British Bulldog, The Anvil, and Brian Pillman. That, to me, elevates the star power of the match, because Razor had just been challenging for the WWF title, albeit unsuccessfully, but he's still being positioned as a main eventer in the people's eyes. And like I said, Goldust had never, I think he had maybe like one WWF title shot when Shawn was the champion in '96, just like maybe on a random Raw, but like he was never elevated to that level in the people's eyes. Stone Cold can still get pinned. That's still going to be the ending because the Hart Foundation were positioned as the baby faces at that time. So I think that's fine the way it went down. What can happen there, in all honesty, in my opinion, is SummerSlam still turns out the same way. And when I thought long and hard about it, I couldn't really think of anybody for Scott Hall to have a good feud with, because obviously I was thinking about putting him with the British Bulldog, but he had the feud with Ken Shamrock. So I'm going to hold off on him pairing him with the Bulldog. One, because I didn't think they worked well together, and two, that would again relegate Scott Hall for the European title, which I don't think was a belt of any significance at that point, in all honesty. What actually I would do instead was Stone Cold still has the neck injury. He gets pile driven, unfortunately, by Owen Hart, almost breaks his neck. And then him and Dude Love, the team of love and hate, have to forfeit the tag belts. And then at Ground Zero in Your House, that September of 1997, they do a 4-way match where the Headbangers won the tag team titles. The Headbangers. What I think would have happened instead was Dude Love obviously has to forfeit the title too, even though he's able to wrestle. I think Scott Hall can step in, and then he can step in as Dude Love's partner. So it's Razor and Dude Love. So actually, then they become a makeshift team like Austin and Dude Love. And I think they win that championship, that 4-way championship tag match, instead of the Headbangers. So for the first time ever, Scott Hall, as Razor Ramon, is a WWF Tag Team Champion. And I think they can successfully defend them, because I know the Headbangers literally lost like every match they had as champions in non-title matches, and then just lost the belts to the Godwins the next month at Bad Blood. I actually think they can keep those belts through Bad Blood, because I don't think they should lose them to the Godwins. The Godwins were really doing nothing as a team at that point. I know they had a heel turn, but they literally won them just to lose them to the LOD. Look, the LOD, no offense to the LOD, but this was not the LOD of old. This was an older LOD, and Vince literally Did not give them a good WWF run. I know they had the titles for like 3 weeks, but overall they didn't do anything too significant with them besides lose to the New Age Outlaws. So I think actually, again, you keep the belts on them through October and then into November is actually where I do think they start feuding. Dude Love and so I think it's Dude Love and actually Razor Ramon feuding with the New Age Outlaws. And here's how I'd get the belts off them, in all honesty, to keep Razor protected. The way it happens is Kane can still come out, because I remember Kane faced Mankind at Survivor Series 97. So this is going to happen before the Survivor Series, actually. You'll take the belts off him. I think Kane can still come out and attack Dude Love when he's about to have a singles match as one half of the tag titles, tag team champions. He still choke slams Dude Love on the ramp twice. Razor Ramon can come out, start beating up Kane. Kane no-sells it, and then choke slams Razor in the ring and tombstones him. The Outlaws, the newly formed New Age Outlaws, come out for their tag title match. Dude Love is out cold. He's been choke slammed on the ramp. He's out cold. And Razor is pretty much out of it, having just been choke slammed and tombstoned in the ring. The Outlaws in a quick match, basically because Razor's fighting at an extreme disadvantage now, gets pinned by either, take your pick, the Road Dogg or Billy Gunn. So the Outlaws win the titles, and their short-lived alliance of Razor Ramon and Dude Love is broken up. And in all honesty, I think that's actually a good thing, because then after Survivor Series, they can actually be off. He can be off the show, selling the injury, selling the attack from Kane, and selling the beating he took from the Outlaws. And maybe he does a segment where he tries to get at them. He comes into the ring, and Vince and Jim Ross, or whoever was on commentary, I think it was Jim Ross and the King, can be like, he's not medically cleared, but he's going after the Outlaws. Hits them with chairs and at least gets some revenge to get the crowd into it a little bit. And then, the next night on Raw, after the Screwjob incident, they can have Dude Love and Razor challenge the New Age Outlaws one more time for the tag titles, and in a cheating finish where the Outlaws maybe use brass knucks or a chair. They pin Razor, because actually the next night, I know Mick Foley didn't show up in protest of the Screwjob, so it could be a handicap match again where they can make an excuse that once again Dude Love was taken out, so once again Razor has to go 2-on-1. This time he's fresh. It's a close match where he's maybe even believably about to win a 2-on-1 handicap match to win the titles by himself, but gets pinned at the very end. That would then again fully dissolve their partnership, and now he no longer has interest in the tag titles. And I know Ken Shamrock was the original first challenger for Shawn's WWF title at Degeneration X in Your House. I would swap Shamrock out with Razor Ramon, because Shawn, as a heel now with Degeneration X, Rick Rude was gone now, but with Chyna and Triple H, can be running their mouth saying that they've now disbanded the Hart Foundation. All of the Hart family has now packed up and gone down to Atlanta. And now there's no one left, obviously, that can challenge him for the title, and no one can take this belt from him. Cue the music. Razor walks out, reminds them every time we've met, I've taken the belt from you, and he can talk about beating him at WrestleMania for the Intercontinental title. Now I'm going to beat you for the WWF title. So they can have their feud go into Degeneration X in Your House. Razor challenges for the WWF title. I know in that match Ken Shamrock won by disqualification because, surprise, DX interfered and the match was just thrown out. Same here. Razor hits the Razor's Edge on Shawn. Shawn is done. About to be pinned. 1, 2, and then Triple H and Chyna pull the ref out. Bell rings, disqualification. And then, of course, people remember Owen Hart actually returned at that show after the match and attacked Shawn Michaels. So then that actually had taken Ken Shamrock out of the title picture. That was his only WWF title shot. And that can really be like a one and done for Razor Ramon as well. And to be honest, right there is where I'm going to stop it. I wanted to get through 97, and 98, it would get kind of difficult because, honestly, that's when in 98 Scott Hall's personal problems got much worse. And again, he was sent back to rehab. And then, of course, WCW thought it would be a good idea to bring his real life alcohol problems into an angle. So they would allegedly have Scott Hall show up to Nitros and Thunder's drunk and trying to wrestle while drinking at the same time. So because of that, I'm going to stop it there at 1998. Because I do think that as much as I love the Razor Ramon character, hearing about all the personal issues he had and how much worse it got in the late 90s, I don't think some of that stuff was avoidable even if he stayed under Vince. And I think Vince would have still lost confidence in him just because he wouldn't have been seen as a reliable person because of his personal issues. Not trying to make light of any of that, but I'm just saying I just feel like that's how it would have gone. So I do have other ideas. If you want me to expand into 1998, let me know. Let me know what you think would have happened if Scott Hall didn't leave for WCW and stayed in WWF, how his WWF run would have gone. Do you agree with what I think would have happened? Do you think he could have been a 5-time Intercontinental Champion? Do you think he would have been able to get multiple WWF title shots? And do you think he would have also become a tag champion as well? This is just my thoughts on it. Like I said, if you want me to go into 98 and 99 and go into the Attitude Era, let me know. Leave a comment down below. And part 2 of this is going to be how it would have affected wrestling and how it would have affected WCW and the whole NWO invasion. So again, thanks everyone for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment. And like I said, I want to hear what you think and I want to know your thoughts on this video. Thanks, everyone.